Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. Today we're tackling a big one, the World Bank. And this one's especially important if you're a UPSC aspirant or just diving into the world of international relations. But honestly, whether you're a student hitting the books or just someone who loves to stay informed, this deep dive's for you. We're going to break down the World Bank's initiatives, the impact it has, and of course, all those criticisms it faces. And hey, while you're at it, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring that notification bell so you don't miss any of our future deep dives. Okay, so imagine for a second, an organization with the power to reshape entire economies. It can lift millions out of poverty, or some would argue, push nations deeper into debt. That, my friends, is the World Bank.
You know, the World Bank isn't just one big entity. It's actually a group of 4 institutions, the IBRD, IDA, IFC, and MIGA. Each one plays a specific role, but their collective goal is to reduce poverty. But how they go about it? Well, that's where things get interesting and often debated.
Yeah, it's not just about handing out cash, Ray. I mean, they're involved in some massive development projects, especially here in India. Like take the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, for example. They've helped bring over 17 million children into the education system.
The scale of that is incredible. The SSA, focused on elementary education, has really made some strides, especially when it comes to enrolling those marginalized groups who might have been left behind.
Okay, that's huge.
Yeah.
But then you have those critics who say, education's great, but what about jobs? Well, the World Bank has an answer for that too. They've been supporting programs like Jivika in Bihar.
Jivika is really a fascinating example of how the World Bank empowers communities. From the ground up, they've helped over 1.8 million rural women form self-help groups and even launch businesses. Some of these women are now running successful enterprises, contributing to their families and the local economy. Now, that's a real impact.
Hold on, so they're not just building schools, they're helping women become entrepreneurs. That's pretty cool.
Isn't it?
And it doesn't stop there. There's also Tejaswini, a program specifically designed to help adolescent girls and young women finish their education and get job skills.
Exactly. The World Bank recognizes that investing in women is investing in the future. These programs are all about breaking down barriers and creating opportunities for those who need them most.
So they're tackling social development head on. But what about the big picture? The stuff that really gets an economy moving? We're talking about infrastructure, right?
You got it. The World Bank is heavily involved in infrastructure development in India. You'll find them supporting projects like the National Highway Development Project, which has a massive ripple effect on the economy.
Okay, so improved roads and transportation, they help businesses thrive, create jobs, and ultimately fight poverty. But hold on a second, isn't there a flip side to all this? I mean, an organization this powerful, there's got to be some critics, right?
You're absolutely right. Any organization with this much influence is going to be scrutinized. And there are valid concerns about how decisions are made at the World Bank, who benefits, and the potential downsides of their policies.
Okay, so let's get into those criticisms. One of the big ones is about how power is distributed within the World Bank, right? It's all about this $1, one vote system.
And that system means the countries with the deepest pockets, they have the loudest voices. So this gives developed nations a lot of sway over how resources are allocated and what policies are implemented, even though developing countries are the ones receiving most of the loans.
So it's kind of like a club where the wealthiest members get to make the rules, even though it's supposed to benefit everyone. And then there's this whole issue of sovereign immunity, which sounds pretty intense. What's that about?
Well, sovereign immunity essentially shields the World Bank from being sued by its member countries. Critics argue that this lack of accountability, it tilts the power balance even further and makes it hard to hold the World Bank responsible. When projects go wrong or policies backfire.
Wait, so a country can't take the World Bank to court, even if they believe a project's harming their people? That seems problematic.
It raises serious questions about transparency and accountability. And these concerns get even louder when we look at these structural adjustments often attached to World Bank loans. You see, these structural adjustments are often a key condition for receiving those massive loans. They usually involve implementing certain economic policies like cutting government spending, lowering trade barriers, and privatizing state-owned businesses. The goal is to make these economies more efficient and attractive to foreign investors.
So it's kind of like the World Bank saying, hey, we'll help you out, but you got to play by our rules. But some critics would argue that these policies can actually make things worse for developing countries, especially when it comes to poverty and inequality. How so?
Imagine a country grappling with high unemployment and a struggling healthcare system. Then the World Bank comes in with a loan and says, okay, to get this money, you have to cut your healthcare budget and lay off government workers.
Hold on, that seems a bit backward. You're trying to improve people's lives, but being told to cut essential services.
That's the criticism. These austerity measures, as they're called, can create a downward spiral. Governments have less capacity to tackle social problems, making it even harder for people to escape poverty.
And it sounds like these policies could end up benefiting big corporations more than the local people.
That's a major point of contention. Critics argue that forcing countries to open their markets and deregulate can create an environment where multinational companies swoop in, outcompete local businesses, and extract profits without contributing to long-term development.
So it's not just about economics, it's about power dynamics and who really benefits in the end. And let's not forget about the elephant in the room. Debt taking on huge loans, even with favorable terms, can put a massive burden on developing countries.
Absolutely. Debt repayment can become a huge drain on a country's resources, diverting funds away from crucial things like education, healthcare, and infrastructure. There are even cases where countries end up spending more on servicing their debt than on vital social programs.
It's like they're stuck on a treadmill running just to stay in place. They're trying to improve their economies, but the weight of debt keeps pulling them back. This whole situation raises a huge question. Is the World Bank actually helping these countries achieve real, sustainable development, or is it creating a system where they become dependent on wealthy nations and corporations?
That's the million-dollar question, and it doesn't have an easy answer. The World Bank has played a role in funding important projects and providing technical expertise, but it's crucial to be aware of the potential downsides of their lending practices and to honestly assess their impact on developing countries.
All right, so far we've explored the World Bank's initiatives, lauded its successes, and unpacked those criticisms we've talked about. Power struggles, structural adjustments, the heavy burden of debt, and this complex relationship between developed and developing countries. But there's another layer to this story that we can't ignore. It's something that's increasingly important in today's world, the environmental impact of World Bank projects.
That's right. In recent years, the World Bank has come under fire for funding projects that contribute to things like deforestation, pollution, and climate change. And this brings us to the heart of the global sustainability debate.
So we've talked about the economic and social impacts, but what about the planet? We'll dive into those environmental concerns when we come back for the third and final part of our deep dive into the World Bank. All right, welcome back to the deep dive. We've been unpacking the World Bank, its initiatives, its impact, and those criticisms it faces. We've covered a lot of ground already. From power dynamics and those controversial structural adjustments to the issue of debt. But now, in this final part, we're shifting gears to something we can't ignore, the environmental impact of World Bank projects.
You know, as the world strives for economic development, we can't neglect the health of our planet. The World Bank, with its influence and resources, it has a huge responsibility to promote sustainable practices and mitigate the environmental fallout from its projects.
So let's jump right in. What are some of the biggest environmental concerns surrounding these World Bank projects?
Historically, the World Bank has been criticized for funding projects that contribute to deforestation, especially in sensitive ecosystems like rainforests. Think about projects aimed at extracting natural resources or developing infrastructure. These can have pretty devastating consequences for biodiversity, carbon sequestration, and the livelihoods of indigenous communities.
Yeah, it's that classic dilemma, isn't it? Economic growth versus environmental protection. But surely the World Bank has recognized these concerns by now. Have they taken any steps to address them?
To their credit, they have made an effort to integrate environmental safeguards into their lending practices. They've developed policies to assess the environmental risks of projects, promote sustainable resource management, and mitigate potential damage.
Okay, so that sounds like a step in the right direction.
Mhm.
But are these policies actually effective in the real world? Are they strong enough to prevent environmental damage? Or are they just for show?
That's the big question, and it's a tough one to answer. Critics argue that these safeguards are often inadequate or not enforced properly. They point to cases where projects have gone ahead despite serious environmental concerns, leading to irreversible damage.
So it's not just about having policies on paper. It's about making sure they're actually put into practice and that violators are held accountable. That's where transparency becomes absolutely crucial.
Transparency and accountability are key to holding the World Bank and those countries borrowing from them responsible for their environmental commitments. Critics argue that the World Bank needs to be more upfront about the environmental risks of its projects, involve local communities in the decision-making process, and ensure that those environmental assessments are thorough and independent.
It seems like there's this constant tug of war between economic development and environmental protection. How do we reconcile these two goals that sometimes feel at odds?
That is the challenge we face. The World Bank and really all development institutions, they need to embrace a more holistic approach, one that recognizes the interconnectedness of economic, social, and environmental issues. We need to move beyond this idea of economic growth at any cost and embrace a model that prioritizes the well-being of both people and the planet.
So it's about finding a balance, a way to lift people out of poverty without pushing the planet to a breaking point. It sounds like a huge task, but one we can't ignore.
Absolutely. The World Bank has a critical role to play in this shift towards a more sustainable future. They need to use their financial resources and expertise to support developing countries in adopting clean energy, promoting sustainable agriculture, and building resilience to the impacts of climate change.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've explored the World Bank's initiatives from education to infrastructure, and we've grappled with the criticisms it faces, from power imbalances to those environmental concerns. It's a complex and constantly evolving landscape, and this is just a starting point.
We've examined its successes, confronted its critics, and wrestled with the tough questions about balancing economic growth with sustainability. It's an ongoing conversation and one that we all have a stake in.
Exactly. So as we wrap up this deep dive, we encourage you to keep exploring these issues, challenge assumptions, engage in thoughtful discussions about the future we want to build. Remember, knowledge is power, and together, we can create a world where development is truly sustainable, benefiting both people and the planet. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.